I wanted to make a video on intentionality in firearm design, or building with a purpose. Let me start by saying that I'm completely down with not all builds having a purpose, or sometimes the purpose simply being you want to build something fun. But if your build does have an intended use, then this is the video for you. So what got me thinking about this topic? I recently had an in-depth conversation with a friend regarding a rifle idea he wanted to build. Basically, he had a very distinct intended use for this rifle, but he was struggling to turn that into decisions and in turn purchases of appropriate parts. In the end, I think the discussion we had was half the fun of his build, so I thought I'd share that discussion with you. Let's start with his intended use. He wanted to create a dedicated bug-out rifle that he could stash next to his bug-out bag in case of emergency. Naturally, my first question becomes, define bug-out and emergency. Given that he lives in the country, but within about an hour's drive of a major city, he defined the need to bug out as trouble showing up at his doorstep. Therefore, he's not getting into his car and driving away. He already lives, quote-unquote, away. He is grabbing his kit and heading out into the wilderness to try and shake whatever trouble it is that's arrived. Great. So what kind of wilderness are we talking about here? We're talking hilly terrain that makes for a strenuous hike, but it's definitely doable, albeit very hot most of the year. The terrain is extremely rocky and dusty, and although it features dense vegetation, it's all fairly short. The trees are taller than a man, but we're not talking about a looming forest here. Just enough to ruin lines of sight, even if you're shooting from hill ridge to hill ridge in most cases. Once we defined his use case with more detail, we started discussing the implications they have on how he designs his firearm. We came up with a few design principles to stick to. 1. Lightweight is preferred. 2. Everything to make the rifle work should be on the rifle so that it can be grabbed quickly. 3. Durability and reliability are crucial. 4. Comfort while hiking is a plus. 5. Signature reduction is desired. 6. Size of weapon should be minimized where feasible. And 7. Ammo should be selected, as always, to match the rifle and the intended use. Let's deep dive into these principles one by one and discuss the design and parts decisions that he made because of them. Let's talk lightweight and everything must be attached first. The strenuous hiking and heat meant it was a good idea to save on weight. But since this is a potentially life-saving tool, it should only be done in areas where reliability wouldn't be impacted by the weight saving. This meant superfluous accessories, especially ones that require tools not attached to the rifle, should be left out. So nods and IR lasers are a no-go. Another reason would be that he's running, not on the offensive, so avoidance is more important than detection or engagement. But mostly these things aren't needed because any weight he takes on for an IR laser, it becomes worthless unless he remembers to also grab the other gear, his night vision, during his bug out. That would have been a lot of weight associated with maybe remembering to grab his nods and maybe it being nighttime. So where could we save weight then? The first place seemed to be in the handguard. There was no intention to strap any accessories to it, especially aiming-based ones, so rigidity wasn't a major concern. Neither was heat, since signature reduction was a principle, and thus it was unlikely that he'd be blasting hundreds of rounds out in rapid succession. Not that he could carry all those rounds anyways. Next was the scope mount. There are plenty of rugged scope mounts out there that reduce weight. We also discussed only needing to shoot short distances in a little bit, so this seemed like a safe place to save as well. Warren has a good reputation, so we went with their skeletonized MSR mount. Finally, weight was reduced in his suppressor choice, which we'll discuss in detail later. To close out the "it must be attached" concept, he settled on the Fab Defense GL Core Mag stock. This stock comes with a hidden 10-round magazine in it. So simply by grabbing the rifle as is, he now gets 40 rounds instead of 30. Handy. In the end, the build ended up being 6 pounds, 12.5 ounces, fully loaded with rounds and the suppressor attached. The scope, with mount choice, sadly added another 29 ounces, but it was worth it for durability. He knew that durability in his optic was of primary concern, and if he had to spend money and ounces somewhere, this was it. The rocky terrain is subject to sliding, so expect to fall, ding the rifle, etc. When it comes to optics, higher price generally goes to better glass and durability, so he knew this would be the purchase that hurt. Okay, but which type of optic? Red dot or low power variable optic? We know that the brush means most shots would take place within about 100 yards. When hitting streets, this might increase to 200 or 300 yards, but due to the hills, no further than that. My suggestion was to take one of each, even cheap versions not attached to a rifle yet, and go LARP around in the woods. After a few hours of LARPing, he said it was easy to decide. While the close distances made red dot versus LPVO a tough decision, the reality was that there were a million things to hide behind. So if forced to use the rifle, precision at closer distances was key. Therefore, the LPVO won. Given the likely distances, the lower end of the LPVO magnification range was perfectly fine, and therefore he chose a 1:6 magnification LPVO in the form of the SIG Tango 6T. Next, we'll talk comfort. If put to use, the rifle would, by definition, be hiked with. This meant knee banging would be a concern. I suggested the Vickers Combat Application Sling, as it has the pull tab that lets you keep the rifle tight and close for times of movement, and then quickly let it out to deploy it for use. I also recommended an end plate with a QD mount. By having the sling anchored to the end plate as opposed to the stock, you shift the anchor point lower, and thus the rifle sits up higher when cinched tight, making for, again, less knee banging. Given the dense brush, it could mean the rifle would be deployed in tight confines. The SIG Tango's eye relief on 1x magnification is very forgiving, so you could use the scope with the stock fully extended or brought in a few clicks comfortably. For that likelihood, he used a Magpul K2 grip with a more vertical angle for added comfort when running the gun with the stock pulled in during close confines use. Signature reduction was important, as the best strategy if on the run from a hostile force is to not be found, or for them to not even know you're running from them out there at all. If God forbid you do have to use your rifle, then it would be great if it was hard to detect where your shots were coming from. This leads to two strategies: suppression and camo. Suppression of 5.56 generally sucks, so all he could hope to achieve was a bit of sound reduction, but more so a suppressor's ability to somewhat mask where the shots come from, and also diminish any signature associated with the blast kicking up dust in his dry environment. Since that was all of his expectation, he could go cheap, short, and light. Making it a cheap suppressor also meant it would hurt less to keep it on a dedicated rifle ready to grab and go at any moment. Cheap, short, and light meant the YHM Turbo K. Done. For camo, his mind immediately went to fancy paint jobs like multicam and tiger stripe. But since this wasn't where he had agreed his money would be put to best use, we discussed what camo actually is. Camo is a disruption pattern that makes it so your gun-shaped object doesn't actually look gun-shaped in your environment. Therefore, all we needed was to color match his environment and reduce the continuity of color across sections of the gun so it doesn't appear to be one homogeneous gun shape anymore. It was much cheaper to buy his furniture in various shades of FDE and Coyote and then have the major components painted in solid rock-like colors than it was to get a camo Cerakote job. In the end, he had the handguard Cerakoted Patriot Brown and the receivers done in Battleship Gray. It's worth noting that none of the colors selected have any metallics in them. For length, he didn't need a full-length barrel if he was rarely reaching out past 100 yards and at max 300, but there was a desire to not go the SBR route. This was another reason for choosing the YHM Turbo K, as it comes with a quick detach mount. This means he could do a pinned and welded muzzle device on a sub 16-inch barrel and stay perfectly legal. This was preferred to using a 16-inch barrel with a direct thread suppressor, as you save a couple of inches when the two pieces are combined, since the muzzle device nestles into the suppressor quite deep. It's worth noting that YHM does not recommend pinning and welding their muzzle devices, as there is a spring which, if it wears out, you're a bit screwed, as you can't get a replacement over the muzzle device to install it. But since this suppressor would live on this rifle, wear from frequent removal and attachment wasn't a concern of his. Lastly, we come to ammo. His ammo selection had to contend with a few of his previous decisions. One, his penned and welded muzzle device route means he's going to get slightly less velocity out of his rifle than a standard 16-inch rifle. 5.56, when used defensively, favors higher velocities to have good terminal ballistics. So what could he do to retain some of that punch? 2, for fast acquisition under stress, he selected the BDC reticle for his Tango 6T. Therefore, his ammo choice needs to match up to the lines on that reticle pretty decently, or else it's useless. Once his build was complete, I told him to grab a bunch of different ammo and chronograph it for velocities. Then we used a BDC calculator to see which ones had drops that reasonably lined up with the drop lines in the scope. Out of the ones that did, I recommended picking something with more mass to add back that punch and also favor something with a known quality terminal ballistic. For him, that was AAC's 77 grain open tip match. The heavier 77 grain gave him back some of that punch, while our velocity and drop calculations showed that out of his gun, 0 to 100 yards, he was spot on for the BDC 0 and 200 yard lines. Everything out past 200 yards, he then simply had to subtract 25 yards and he'd be spot on again. For example, the 300 yard line became his 275 yard hit, and so on. That's close enough for this use. Thanks for listening in, and I hope you found our thought process and decision-making style educational and fun. For those that are going to ask, here are the parts I didn't specifically mention, since they either had no impact on the intended use, or if they did, it was minimal and associated kind of with weight saving. So he used BCM's recoil mitigation system, BCM receiver, CMC flat-faced trigger, Lantac M-Spec bolt carrier group, Odinworks' Ragna handguard, Ballistic Advantage's middle-of-the-road barrel, a YHM dimpled gas block for reliability, and a Magpul foregrip. It's also worth noting that in this video, he has a windowed Magpul PMag, while in reality he keeps it loaded with an OK Industries SureFeed magazine. Since the magazine is kept loaded, he liked the idea of metal feed lips and their purported longevity under pressure.